Hello, everyone. It's great to be here today. Rewilding. Most of you, I'm sure, have heard the term. Perhaps some of you don't know the origins. It dates back to the 90s when David Foreman started promoting the idea of rewilding North America. And it's a conservation method that essentially gives control back to nature and allows for minimal human intervention so that nature can do what it does best, which is restore its own ecosystems. And so obviously it's been a very successful strategy over the last couple of decades in terms of restoring marine wildlife in the Mediterranean, certain zones in the UK, even some cities where I live in the UK, I live in London, like Manchester, now have urban planning that involves rewilding certain parts of Manchester. Perhaps some of you have heard of the Champs-Élysées, I'm also French, and the extraordinary garden that they're turning it into, and that has some aspects of rewilding. So you might ask, what does this have to do with the fashion industry, with fashion economics, with the fashion infrastructure? Well, as far as economics and GDP, definitely rewilding futures might seem like a very ludicrous idea. But the thing is that I'm a futurist, and I have been for over a decade after being a fashion designer for many years. And where I'm sitting from, I kind of live in a permanent jet lag. 5, 10 years from now, sometimes 30 years, I've authored scenarios for the end of the century for publications like Dazed. And this is what is on everyone's mind. All of the innovators, all of the pioneers, this is what they're talking about, and this is the space that I'm living in as well. Because obviously, we're thinking about new infrastructures, we're thinking about new systems, but deeply what this signals is that we're also searching for new ideals. And rewilding futures creates a breakthrough and is currently starting to influence art. It's influencing architecture, urban planning, design, wellness, and different approaches to society, and is essentially indicative of a time when we need to envision a regenerative era, a term you've heard a lot of today, in business, design, manufacturing, including science, that's aligned with a whole living systems perspective. Some of you might know the RSA, the Royal Society of the Arts. I'm a fellow of this organization, and they promote a system framework called Design for Life, which is looking at beyond sustainability, regeneration from a place where we are all part of an ecosystem, and we think from a perspective also of interspecies health. So before I move on to more positive things, I'd like to still talk a little bit about the problem. And full disclosure, I hope this is a safe space here, and that I can be fully transparent, and I definitely count myself as well as part of the problem. Obviously, many of you know that in 2023, we crossed 6 out of the 9 planetary boundaries, and that the World Economic Forum has recognized that biodiversity loss is one of the largest global security threats. And the problem is that when it comes to the climate emergency, the fashion system is broken. That doesn't mean it's broken forever, but at the moment, it's broken. There's a lack of solutions for vision. Obviously, my niche is futures thinking. And the issue is that we are in such a challenged economic era that we're pulled towards short-term solutions. Obviously, I know that in this room, many of us are already putting many solutions in place, but I'm talking about problems at a global scale that require us to really push farther and be the spokespeople and use our power of influence even more. Because this is a wartime effort, and this is perhaps an invisible war, but we are at war, make no mistake. In my field, decades-old future foresight approaches are simply incompatible with our new challenges. We base the validity of fashion trends based on value systems that are simply not valid, based on virality, the number of likes, the number of sales, and essentially the chase of what we call in fashion hype. There's also a certain level, obviously, of risk adversity in terms of, in a way, knowing that we need to solve the problems fast, the problems that are right in front of us. And the issue is that essentially, and we don't do it necessarily intentionally, but on a global scale, we essentially micro-scam ourselves out of a thriving future. So make no mistake, though, this is a story of radical hope. I might have listed some problems, but futuring and working in futures is an act of hope. Some of you might have heard the term imagination activism. And many years ago, I started my slide deck with every talk that I gave, every keynote, with "I believe we will all be futurists someday." And I do want perhaps my job one day to disappear, because we will all be futurists. And this is evidenced by the global prioritization of future-focused initiatives on the agendas of multilateral organizations ranging from the OECD to the UN to European nations. And just in September last month, we saw the introduction of the Pact for the Future and the Declaration on Future Generations during the United Nations General Assembly. And that same month, the UN released its 2.0 Quintet of Change, which essentially lays out the 5 key skills for our era. And one of them is my favorite. It's foresight. So what we need really is radical hope and to turn ourselves into visionaries. And so this is a diagram that I created recently that I've also been sharing with clients. And this really resonates because I think many of us want to have the role of the decoder. The decoder is essentially someone who is able to shift from information to action and transformation and helps handhold society or communities into hospicing old system and transitioning into the new. Because at this moment, we're not only in a transition and trying to create a just transition for our current society or for the next decade and to meet our 2030 goals, we're in a civilizational transition. This is a transition that will be talked about in the future, not just in terms of the 2020 decade, but of the 100, 200, 300-year period we were in. And when you look back, if some of you perhaps watch archaeology documentaries on the Egyptian era, we never talk about this decade in the Egyptian era. We always talk about this period of 100, 150, 200 years. And this is how we will talk about our era. So visionary leaders, and I think there are many of us here today, hopefully, I think we can all call ourselves visionaries. We need to meet our power of influence and challenge the status quo. So this requires us to also dream of future realities and kind of step away from market pressures, which is specifically hard when we're dealing with margins and bottom lines and numbers, obviously. But this is probably the most pragmatic business strategy at the moment. And brands especially, and I come from saying this again as a former fashion designer and as a former future trend forecaster, one of the things that you can start doing is to ditch the seasonal forecast model. So, and you have to, stay with the present, stay in the now, but engage either parts of your teams or parts of your initiatives to live in a different space and in a different time zone. A little bit like kangaroos. Kangaroos hold 3 babies at the same time, one gestational, one in their pocket, and one that's running around. And that's what we need to do with time right now. Our sense of time is different because of the scope of the emergency that we're in. So because of this, we have to think in systems and not trends. And we also need to understand that trends themselves are not the problem. Trends And our relationship, especially with fast trends, are just indicative of the general market and the consumer and the media's obsession with the new. So in order to think in systems, and not only that, and I'm going to quote Thomas Suddendorf from the great book, The Invention of Tomorrow, thinking about the future is clearly powerful, but thinking about our thinking about the future is even more so. So we have to do this right. And one of the first things we have to do is end our obsession with hype. And obviously this is a little bit different from infrastructure and supply chains. I consult with agencies that deal with media, marketing, and PR for large fashion brands. And the biggest issue they have is our obsession with virality and confusing cultural virality with cultural validity. And this does matter to manufacturers and financiers because it affects how consumers shop and where they go and how they are influenced in their tastes. So this discourse is already on its last legs. A lot of thought leaders in the media and fashion and innovation space are sick of our relationship with hype and are authoring kind of a new era around our relationship with fashion trends, which I think is really, really positive, because we need to rewrite the brief. And by the way, these are slides from a report that you can also download that I authored with agency Gung Ho called Hypercycle. But essentially, the planet is the client, period. And so we need a regenerative approach to future foresight, a regenerative approach to futuring, not only a regenerative approach to supply chains. When we start collections, when we look at future strategies, we need to rethink also how we approach the future. Just simply from that perspective, we have to get under the hood if we want to author supply chains and future strategies differently. We also have to examine the methods and the principles that we've been using for decades and perhaps where they need to be recalibrated. So a couple of years ago, because I started a school for future foresight in 2019, and it started out teaching more conventional yet challenging methods of future foresight for executive leaders or even graduate students, for a number of people interested in futures. And I realized that we needed to change the brief and really think about future foresight also from an emergence perspective, looking at it from a regenerative perspective. So I created a framework called world building, the world building framework. And this kind of echoes the title that I gave myself called Regenerative Futures Architect, which is a title that doesn't exist yet, but let's face it, one of our previous speakers said that the future is here and yesterday, and we need to create these jobs today. So I'd like to share now a couple of guidelines in terms of how you might be able to start some of the key aspects of world building framework and becoming a regenerative futures architect, which Rewilding Futures falls under. So to become a regenerative futures architect, you need to approach your approach to future foresight from three perspectives. From the perspective of emergence. So you understand the mainstream, but you really have to focus on what's on the cutting edge, what's being pioneered. So you have to study the behaviors and look at it also from a very diverse perspective. You have to focus on creative foresight. Creative foresight are the practices that essentially are similar to design fiction and speculative design. So although you might use future trend reports, you need to also use immersive ways of creating the future and living in it, whether it's staging it, storytelling, narratives of the future, as if you're in it now, and create very emotional scenarios. And finally, a regenerative futures architect focuses on futures literacy and always learning how futures are done. So from number one, rewild your imagination. Understand that the future is always altered. It is not necessarily a continuation of the present. I think we know this very well, having just gone through a pandemic. The future is plural. My future is different to someone in Manila. the future is multiple futures. There are multiple scenarios. You saw a speaker earlier, considering multiple scenarios. And the future is emotive. The future is something that we need to experience and empathize with as if we're already living that future. And those are key, a very big overview of what is called speculative design, which is already used by governments to understand future risks, for example, around cybersecurity. It's used by Visa. It's used very often to understand global risks and prepare for potential scenarios. So this is a scenario, for example, by agency Arab of London in 2060, how this person is dressing, how this person is living every day. There's been some kind of big climate event in this scenario called abundance. And we can even see there are posters of the communities and how they live in London in that moment. And this is what I mean by a future that is immersive. So this is potentially engaging with your design teams and your creative teams in a different way. Rewild your future foresight. In world building and rewilding futures, we look at biological strategies and notably biomimicry as well to inform rewilding foresight, which is a practice of essentially looking at biological strategies and adapting them to how they might affect how we approach trends. So, for example, with rewilding future trends, we look at 4 different future scenarios, and we ask, how would nature do this? How would a bristlecone pine tree that can live for 3,000 years deal with this trend? I know that this might sound different, but this is the space where I'm existing. Symbiosis foresight is also another example of how we look more at the principles of interdependence and how we as ecosystems and as biomes, Venice in itself is a biome, we exist, and applying that to future trends. So here's an example in industry of Refik Anadol, who is one of the most famous digital artists of today. He built the large nature model, which is essentially an AI language model that was fed millions of information and data points about nature, and that large language model then creates art. And that's kind of the idea that is really starting to take hold with the creative industries. Rethink the metrics of trend is a big one, and that's number 4. So with rethink the metrics of trend, this is actually the diagram for the planetary boundaries diagram. I don't know if some of you have been following this work. There was a big Netflix documentary about it. So looking at this wheel and understanding when we start to go beyond what's safe in our boundaries, how can we apply this to the way that we approach trends? For example, so each quadrant is a biological strategy and an aspect of a trend. So you could apply this wheel to one trend and see how it's benefiting the ecosystem. And these are the kinds of wheels and new metrics that we need to use rather than just judging a trend from the basis that it's viral or anything as such. So how this is also being cross-transferable in industry, the Future Observatory, which is part of the London Design Museum, just recently released Bioregioning, which is essentially a whole different way of looking at the metrics of what are our regions. We're also looking at a whole new ways of manufacturing. How can factories also behave as far as by PCH innovation? And so finally, I leave you also with thinking about adopting inside-out sustainability. We just talked about workers, and this is more of a psychological and human resources modality. But as teams, I've seen so many innovators and so many thought leaders talk about sustainability and regenerative systems and want them but not treat themselves that way or not treat their teams that way. So in order to also lead with sustainability, we need to slow down. We need to also give ourselves time for reflection. Creativity is not a metric. Creativity is something that takes time. We need to think about slow forecasting. So finally, if you'd like to scan this or email me at hello@Geraldine-Wharry, I'm happy to share these slides, and there will be bonus references as well that I'll share. For those of you who contact me, you can scan this or email me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Geraldine.
Yeah.
Thank you.